wanted to look at why, why do we have an inner critic, right? Essentially, like, where does it come from? And I think that this is really important for us to understand, where does our inner critic come from? Because, like I said, if we don't understand where it comes from or why it's talking to us in that way, it is very easy to be like, fuck you, oh my God, my inner critic's such a bitch, or, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it's okay to say that your inner critic's being a bitch, for sure, because he or she can be, definitely. There is no doubt about that. But like I said, once we understand where it comes from, the idea is hopefully we can actually, you know, meet it from that place of love and compassion. So back in cave people times, we had to constantly be on the lookout for threats. And, you know, this was things like animals that could kill us. Like, you know, we were constantly searching for food so that we didn't run out, like all that kind of stuff, right? And what that did is it actually created within us what's wired into us, and it's called, or it's known as a negativity bias. And that's just where, and I'm sure that you guys can relate to this, right? Where, you know, there's a scenario and we go straight to the absolute worst thing that can happen. We just, like, you know, our mind goes straight into, well, you know, this could happen, or no, I can't do that because this could happen, if that makes sense. So that's that negativity bias. We are often on high alert, or we're wired to see the worst thing that can happen first, because when you think about it, it makes sense. If we're prepared for the worst, hopefully we have more chance of surviving, because if we're prepared for that animal to attack us and it attacks us, we have more chance of surviving, versus if we're like, you know, everything's sunshine and daisies, and then the animal attacks us and we're not prepared, well, we're fucked. So that negativity bias was wired into us, and I'm talking about back in cave people times because, to be honest, a lot of this stuff that comes up is coming from the part of our brain that is, which is, like, you know, right back down here. It's our primal brain. It's known as the reptile brain, and essentially that part of the brain, all it cares about is that our heart's beating, our lungs are breathing, basically that we're alive, right? So, and that's the brain from, like, right back when, like, you know, that's all that we could comprehend. Since then, our brain has evolved, and we've, you know, got the part of the brain which has, like, the emotions and the feelings, but the logical part of the brain which allows, like, conscious thought and all of that. So, but basically where I'm talking, or what I'm talking about right now, is that very primal reptile brain. And like I said, all it cares about is there's food, there's water, there's shelter, we're alive, done. And that we reproduce, because that's how we keep humanity going, right? So we've got this negativity bias in us, that's been wired from back in cave people times. And we learned back in those times that it was, I guess, the best way to be, or to survive, was to have two things. One was a tribe, so belonging. And I'm going to explain this quickly. So if you think of, you're in the jungle and you're in a tribe, first of all, if you've got more people, you've got people to hunt, you've got people to gather, you've got people to cook, you've got people to make huts. Like, you know, everyone's kind of doing their part and helping the whole community thrive, right? So it's kind of like strength in numbers. But then it's also, when you think about it, if you're in a tribe of 50 people and a saber-toothed tiger comes along, you got, like, you know, a lot more chance of surviving than if it's just you and a saber-toothed tiger comes along. So literally, it's like, you know, it's wired into us to want to belong, to want to surround ourselves or feel like we belong in a tribe. And that is why we care what people think. That is why we avoid judgment. Judgment is very much seen as like a threat. to that part of the brain, because if they judge us, then they might leave us or they might no longer love us, etc., etc. So we avoid not being liked, we avoid judgment, we avoid being left, we avoid not belonging, essentially. So all of those fit into the I guess the category of belonging. So we've learned to survive by belonging. So that's the first one. Now the second one is essentially my mentor Marina Perry actually used to say that it was being right, and I kind of love that, and that stuck with me for so I will explain it in that way, but essentially it can also be known as certainty or safety. So we survived through belonging and being right. Now, being right, I'm going to explain that. So again, back in cave people time, we're out and we're picking berries, and there's a beige lump off behind that bush, and one of us is like, fuck, it's a lion, drop everything, run, right? And the other person's like, nah, it's just a rock, we're fine. Yeah, and they stay and they keep picking berries. Which one is more likely to survive? Essentially the one who runs, because if it's a lion, they hopefully ran in time to survive. If it's a rock, they ran, they had a bit of anxiety, but they still survived, right? The person who stayed and picked berries saying, oh, it's just a rock, if it's a lion, they're fucked, they got eaten, right? And if it's just a rock, then they survive. So they kind of had 50-50, whereas the other person had a lot more chance of surviving. So that's what I mean about we've learned to survive by being right, or in other words, to stick with what we know. So for example, another great analogy is like, we're out picking berries and we're kind of like, I don't know if this berry is poisonous or not. I have a feeling it is. So they don't eat it. They survive. Versus, I don't know if this is poisonous or not, let's give it a go. And then they die. So we've learned to stick with what we know. We've learned to stick with certainty for safety and survival. And that's why we tend to repeat patterns and repeat cycles in our lives. That's why we tend to date the same people all the time. It's why we tend to sabotage in the same way and just keep recreating this reality, is because it's known. We've survived it already, so we know we can survive it again. Does that make sense? Just pop a little like yes in the chat box if that makes sense, or ask questions if you have any. Yeah, awesome. Amanda said, yeah, perfect. I'm glad that you guys are following, because sometimes I feel like I just blah, blah, blah. Awesome. So then if you think of bringing, like, back in cave people times, the threats were literally life and death. But the thing is, even though the threats aren't life and death anymore, it still brings up the same reaction in our body. Our body still goes into fight, flight, freeze, appease. And we have that reaction. And, exactly as I think it was Sarah was saying before, it's that high alert, right? When we're in that high alert because we're looking for threats. And that's essentially just being in a constant state of stress. So bring it into this day and age, we're facing off with different threats, but the inner critic is still seeking survival through belonging and through certainty, or the known. So our inner critic, basically, to give you to now bring it into why it talks to us the way that it does, it gets really loud to keep us in belonging. So for example, it'll tell you, don't wear that, you look ridiculous, because it's scared that, oh, well, if you wear that and people judge me, we won't be in belonging anymore, and then who knows if we can survive. Does that make sense? Like it seems really drastic, but again, like that part of you is trying to keep you alive with what it knows, and that is belonging and certainty. And so it'll get really loud to stop us from being judged or being abandoned, because that keeps us in belonging. or when we're straying from what we already know. So, you know, Sarah, you shared that you stepped into this new role, and it's a role that you're learning and etc., but it's new, and that your inner critic's been going crazy because we've strayed from the known. We've stepped into something that's unknown. And so the inner critic's kind of like, red alert, fuck no, like get the fuck out. You know, we don't know this. We don't know if we can survive, because what if we fuck up and someone judges us? What if we fuck up and we're no longer in belonging? People no longer like us. What if we fuck up and we can't survive? You know, the fact that we screwed up or we did this, blah, 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 blah. Like, does that make sense? Again, just pop in the chat or jump out if you know, have something that you want to ask or say. My chat box is...
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Yeah, cool. So we can kind of see where it's coming from then, like about how it's trying to keep us in belonging, but it's also trying to keep us safe and kind of bring us back to the known. And it's and that's why, like, you know, some of our biggest growth work happens when we step out of our comfort zone. But the inner critic is trying to keep us in our comfort zone, because our comfort zone is known, our comfort zone is safe, we've survived it already, so we have more chance of surviving it again. Even though, and this is what I also want to explain, is that that part of the brain, that real primal part of the brain, the reptile brain, even though we might be miserable, we might be in a state of stress, right, on high alert and exhausted and just like literally miserable, that part of the brain doesn't comprehend that. All it comprehends is, we're alive. Yes, I'm doing my job. Like, it's like, yep, we are still alive. I can have a party. I'm fucking awesome. That's what that part of the brain, all it cares about is being alive. You are still surviving. Great, it's done its job. So that's where we actually have, with the different parts of our brain, we have this conflict where that real primal part's like, only do what you know and stay in belonging, and it will say and do anything to keep you in that, because that's survival, versus that part of the brain which is more, you know, logic, it has conscious thoughts, it's a bit more abstract, all of that, which is like, well, I want to grow, I want to do different things, blah, blah, blah. So have you ever noticed that sometimes we have that internal struggle where it's like this part of us that wants to go and explore or do something new, and this part of us that's like, whoa, fuck no. And again, you can just pop it in the chat, just pop a yes, or jump in if you want to share something. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so that's essentially like what we get to understand about our inner critic, is it's very much coming from that place of, it's trying to keep you in belonging and trying to keep you in certainty, because that's how we survive. Now, some things that we also get to know is that our brain perceives the world around us based on what it's already experienced. So if we've been criticized or judged or basically experienced any pain or hurt, our brain will then create the negative self-talk, which is the inner critic, to protect us from doing that again. So let's say, for example, you know, I've heard people of, like, you know, people who they got up in front of their school to do a presentation and accidentally said orgasm instead of organism, and everyone laughed. And because that was horrifying to them and it was so embarrassing, they felt so judged, and it was really hurtful for them to be in that position. Like, obviously it's a really vulnerable position to be in there in front of the whole school, people are laughing, and, you know, not for everyone, but for some people they kind of code that as, like, you know, almost death. Like, that's the one thing that they're most afraid of, is being laughed at by other people or being judged by other people. Like, we all kind of have a fear of something, and for some people that's literally their worst fear, is that other people are going to judge me or think less of me. And so for that person, their inner critic is then every time they go to speak, potentially, it might start with every time that they speak in big numbers, like every time they speak in front of a class or, in front of a big crowd of people, their inner critic's like, nah, shut up, don't do it. They're going to laugh at you, blah, blah, blah. Like, notice it's saying all the things to stop them from having that experience again. Because it's like, no, remember that last time. We don't want that again. So don't do that. And the thing is, when we explored before of how your inner critic can impact your life, for that person, potentially it can build and build and build to the point where they just have no voice. They just don't speak up for themselves because the inner critic has beat them down so much and told them not to speak up so much that they just don't voice their opinion. They don't stand up for themselves because of that time that I did speak in front of people and they laughed. Does that make sense? Like our inner critic can actually be going nuts to try and protect us from reliving or re-experiencing a previous pain, or like hurt, like an experience that was perceived as like almost like death. And I don't know if you guys, I know it sounds really dramatic that I'm saying it feels like death, but again, to that part of the brain, it does feel like death. And everyone's wired with a different kind of fear. But can you think of that thing that you're like, I would absolutely either not be able to do that, or like, it is literally my worst fear that happens, kind of thing. And that's actually got a little, like, that's telling you something as well. And so then you get to notice, like, where does my inner critic come up and stop me from doing something that might result in that? So yeah, so that's also something that we get to know about the inner critic. And then finally, the last little piece of the puzzle is that our inner critic can essentially provide us with insulation. So let's say that we've been criticized for something previously, maybe we made a mistake in class or something like that, and someone criticized us and told us that we were stupid, or like, or said something and we perceived it as they were telling us we're stupid. Then our inner critic might start to tell us that we're stupid, blah, 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 and keep repeating that, so that if someone else says it to us, it's not going to sting as much because we already say it to ourselves, if that makes sense. So it's kind of offering like insulation for if someone else is going to judge me for that, well, it's like, well, I'm already saying it. So it doesn't sting as much, if that makes sense. Yeah, so that's a little bit of information around why we have it. Is that all making sense to you guys? I would love to know like what your thoughts are, what's coming up for you, having read or heard this.
I think the belonging piece for me is what I'm more think I can't think of the word. Because for me, I think that's what it's more about. It's about belonging and being liked. And I think even when you want, like my people pleasing, wanting that validation, I think that's where it all comes from.
Yeah, 100%. And so do you see now a little bit, or have a bit more insight into why you kind of care about what people think and you want people to like you?
Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. And so it's not wrong. It's literally just how we've learned to survive. And it's not a bad thing to want to be liked. But I think what we do get to do is come to ourselves first and like ourselves first, so that we don't need that validation from other people as much. But yeah. Beautiful, beautiful awareness. Yeah, I love that. And I would also love to point out that everyone's going to resonate with something different from this. So some people will be a bit more like, oh yeah, I do stick to the known all the time. I don't really go outside my comfort zone very much. And some of us will really notice, oh yeah, I do really fear judgment. I do really fear abandonment from people. Like, you know, some people will notice, oh yeah, I love to just constantly have control over situations, which is the safety, the certainty. Some people, yeah, like, you know, some people will notice a bit of both. And there's no right or wrong, but we just get to hopefully now have a bit of insight as to why we have our inner critic, why it's there, and why it can be so fucking nasty sometimes. And so can we see that it's actually kind of coming from a place of it's wanting to protect us. It's essentially coming up to stop us from doing things where it's perceived that we might not survive it or that we might experience pain or hurt. And like I said, the threats are just different. So back in the day, it was life or death. Now, like I said, it's pain and it's hurt, right? Because think about when someone does judge us, when someone does leave us, or we feel like people don't like us, it's hurtful, right? Self-preservation, yes, that's right. Yeah, like it's hurtful. And think about when something goes wrong, and we feel like a failure, we feel like, you know, I'm trying to think, like basically, like, you know, when if we think about the whole sticking with the known, when we stray from the unknown and it doesn't work out, like think about how shit that can feel, how much that can hurt us, and how much that can be a fucking hit to our ego, right? And so essentially we get to realize that the inner critic, while it's no longer fighting life or death, it's now just different threats. And it's not life or death, but it's still coded the same. It's still coded as potential death, which again sounds dramatic, but again, like that's just the real primal part of your brain. And so it's trying to protect us from pain and hurt. So what we get to realize is that even though it may not be an effective strategy, our inner critic is actually coming from a place of love. It loves you so much that it wants to protect you from danger. It wants to keep you alive. Like it is doing everything it fucking can to keep you alive. It wants to stop you from being hurt. And so when the inner critic does come up and we want to get angry at it and be like, fuck off, bitch, like, you know, God, you're ruining my life, kind of thing, or pretend it's not there or push it away, can we instead see that it has a positive intention behind it, that it's coming from a place of love and protection? Can we accept that our inner critic is a part of us? And this is something that I want to, that I'm also really big on when it comes to the inner critic, is that the inner critic is a part of us. And if we are in rejection or resistance or hate, anger, have any of those feelings towards a part of us, then we're not able to love ourselves fully. Because true self-love is when we accept and love all of our parts. So think of a part of you that you love, like that's really easy to love. You know, for example, for myself, it's that I love to help people. I love that I love to help people. And so think of that, but then think of a part of you that is not so easy to love. Like, you know, for example, the jealous bitch in me. You know, she's there. I get to recognize that she's there. I get to not pretend that she's not. And I just get to accept that she's there. And just like the inner critic, there would be some effective ways that she shows up, and there would be some ineffective ways that she shows up. And I just get to choose which I give power to. So we get to, having said that, love and accept the parts of us, including our inner critic. Because if we, like, If we hate the inner critic, we're hating ourselves. If we battle with our inner critic on a daily basis, we're battling ourselves. And think of how much energy we get to free up if we stop battling ourselves on a day-to-day basis. Like, I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I've got from this journey is just like this freedom. Like, honestly, that's the best way that I can describe it. And it also happens to be one of my highest values, but like this freedom from that battle, from that inner struggle on that daily basis, which, you know, as we said before, is fucking exhausting. But also the freedom from the masks, like, you know, all of that. And it all comes from, you know, accepting all parts. We can't truly love ourselves and embrace ourselves and step into that confident, you know, person until we kind of start to work on embracing all of our parts. And, you know, that, like I said, that starts with acceptance. It doesn't always start with love. It starts with acceptance. And then the more that we can accept that part, eventually that builds to compassion, and then eventually that can build to love. And it's the same with our inner critic. So can we meet our inner critic with compassion when it comes up, rather than being like, fuck off, no, like, you know, and meeting it with anger or resentment or fear, which, you know, how often, like, if we think about, our inner critic is actually coming from a vibration of fear, because it's coming from a vibration of, oh, I've got to keep them alive. So it's coming from a vibration of fear. If we meet it with that vibration of fear, what are we then creating? Just more fear. Versus if it's coming at us with fear, but we're up here and we meet it with love, then first of all, you're at a higher vibration, so you have the power and the strength to be able to tame it and take your power back from it. But also, when you meet a scared child with love, like just pure love and compassion, and just hold them and let them know that they're safe, how often do they go from fear and just raise a few, you know, raise their vibration slightly, or come up and meet you there? So we get to kind of see our inner critic the same way. Our inner critic is like that scared little girl or boy. And it's just scared of experiencing that thing that we experienced when we were 6. And so it could literally be, your inner critic could at that point be that little 6-year-old who's like, nah, don't fucking do it, because you're going to experience this again. It's going to hurt and blah, blah, blah. And so again, like see the inner critic as that hurt little child, have that compassion for it, and then watch as, I guess, the vibration of it just raises, because you're just holding like a space of pure love and compassion for it. It's got nowhere else to go. So yeah, I guess we get to have compassion for it being just this scared part of us that's trying to keep us alive, trying to keep us, you know, protect us from danger or hurt. And with that knowledge, we get to actually just be like, thank you. Like, I see you trying to keep me safe. Thank you. But this isn't, you know, effective right now, or this isn't needed right now, or like, I'm safe. I know I can do this, and I know that I'm safe. So thank you, but it's okay. Like, it's almost like you literally get to soothe it like you would a scared little child. So does that make sense? Yeah, awesome. Beautiful. Practice, yeah, definitely. And I think that is something that I'm really big on is, you know, you get to meet your inner critic with compassion, and you also get to meet yourself with compassion on that journey, because you're not going to go from hating your inner critic or ignoring your inner critic, pretending it's not there, to all of a sudden, every time it comes up, oh no, I love you. You're like, you know, I see what you're doing, blah, 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 and meet it with love. It's not going to happen every time. Like, let's not kid ourselves. So we get to recognize that it does take practice. It does take, and it takes consistency. Like, you know, the way that I like to describe it, but obviously being, you know, someone who worked in the fitness industry, is if you want to get raging biceps, you don't go to the gym and do one set of bicep curls and then boom, you got them. You go to the gym regularly to build the biceps that you want. Then once you've got the biceps that you want, do you then just like, sweet, don't have to go to the gym anymore? No, you've got to keep training, right? Because if we don't keep training that muscle, it atrophies, which just means that you lose the muscle because it's not being used anymore. It's literally the same thing when it comes to all of this work, is that it takes reps. You've got to do multiple reps. You've got to keep practicing. You've got to be consistent with it. You know, if you're doing bicep curls once a month, that's not consistent enough to see results. You might, you know, see some results, but maybe not the results that you want. But you've got to be consistent with it. So you've got to do the reps. You've got to do the reps consistently. And even once you get to that stage where you can meet your inner critic with compassion, you've got to continue to meet it with compassion. You've got to continue to build that muscle, or it atrophies and we fall back into old patterns. We fall back into old thoughts and beliefs. But what we do get to realize is as the muscle gets stronger, those bicep curls get easier. So the more that we do practice it, the easier it is to meet it with compassion and love. Yeah, but that's a really great point. And as I said, we get to have compassion for ourselves on that journey, knowing that we're going to drop the ball sometimes, knowing that we're going to get angry at it sometimes and fall into old patterns sometimes. And every time that you fall into an old pattern and you catch yourself there, rather than beating yourself up, I actually want you to like self-five and be like, yes, I caught myself. I noticed. This is just another opportunity for me to like practice bringing compassion to myself, bringing compassion to my inner critic. Sweet, let's go.